1996 was a pretty significant year for the video game industry. We saw the release of Pokemon Red and Blue, Duke Nukem 3D, Quake and Resident Evil amongst many others. The PlayStation had been on the scene for a year or so, dominating Sega and establishing Sony as a big player in the industry. Nintendo was the only one of the big manufacturers without a next generation console on the market, and everyone was eagerly awaiting to see what they were going to do next. Codenamed Project Reality, development of the successor to the SNES began in 1993. Around this time, Silicon Graphics, a big player in computer graphics and supercomputing at the time, was showing an interest in getting into the video game industry and began to develop a prototype of their MIPS R4000 CPU with the intent of reducing its power draw and price considerably. They created a chipset design prototype that could be shown to potential partners, initially meeting with Sega and later with Nintendo. Tom Kalinske, the then CEO of Sega of America, was reportedly quite impressed with the hardware, going so far as to have the team travel to Japan to meet with SGI to examine it more. After troubleshooting and resolving some issues that were found with the hardware, Sega ultimately decided to pass on the deal with SGI. This led them to Nintendo, meeting with their president Hiroshi Yamauchi in early 1993, the deal being struck shortly after. There seems to be some debate over the accuracy of this version of events, however. Nintendo claimed that they got the SGI deal over Sega, not because Sega backed out, because Nintendo offered a better licensing deal, specifically a non-exclusive license, effectively letting SGI work with other partners simultaneously. Either way, Nintendo and SGI's partnership kicked off with what would be known as Project Reality. News of the collaboration initially broke at the 1993 Shoshinkai trade show in August, claiming that the hardware would first be available in arcades and later as a home console. Nintendo even went so far as to reveal a tentative launch price, citing $250 as their targeted number on release. During the console's development, Nintendo sought out and recruited a wide group of developers to help them with the then as unfinished console. This group was simply known as the Dream Team. It consisted of big hitters in the industry such as SGI, Rare, Acclaim, DMA Design, and Time Warner Interactive. It helped design everything from early prototypes of games to the console's new controller. The fifth console generation was the dawn of a new age of 3D graphics. All three console manufacturers took a different approach to the subject, giving us wildly different interpretations of the medium. Sony set the standard early on, offering up relatively easy-to-use tools to make the transition to 3D as easy as possible, with a graphical presentation that many consider to be definitive for the era. Sega, largely out of response to Sony, hastily added 3D capabilities to a console that was otherwise intended to be a 2D powerhouse, and Nintendo took it in a totally different direction to both of them. Both the PlayStation and Saturn had 32-bit consoles, utilising CDs as a medium for storage. CDs offered far more storage capacity than anything else in the market at the time, as well as having far superior quality audio and video capabilities. It was a no-brainer to use them over the previous gen's cartridges. Or so most thought anyway. Nintendo diverged from this on both fronts. Firstly, the N64 was to be a 64-bit console. Not the first, albeit on a technicality. The Atari Jaguar released in November of 1993, but nobody bought it and it was swiftly forgotten about. Secondly, Nintendo opted to retain the cartridge format used on previous consoles, which for many was seen as a bit of a head-scratcher at the time. Cartridges did have some advantages over CDs. They are typically far more robust and medium, can take quite a beating without any noticeable impact in performance, and loading times are dramatically improved over disc-based media, with virtually no time spent waiting to get started. However, this trade-off was seen by most to be worth it. The CDs used by the PlayStation and the Saturn had 10 times more storage capacity available than the carts used by Nintendo, 650 meg compared to a minuscule by comparison 64 meg. This meant that developers often had to make big concessions to get their games to fit on a cart so they could be played on the N64. Often this took the form of reduced audio quality and the absence of video entirely. They also tended to be far more expensive than CDs, had a much longer manufacturing lead time, up to 2 weeks in the N64's case. This meant that publishers would often have to try and anticipate how many copies of a game would be required on release, so as not to print far too many or too few copies, wasting time and money. The N64 was one of the first consoles to use unified RAM, with both the CPU and GPU having a shared pool of 4MB to use. It was decided though that this 4MB was to be expandable, primarily to support the 64DD, a disk-based add-on for the system to be released at a later date that would take advantage of the additional RAM, but more on that later. An expansion pack was available to boost up to 8 meg in supporting games. Most games that took advantage of the additional RAM used it to boost the resolution that they were displayed at. It was seldom a necessity though, and some games, notably Perfect Dark, actually run far worse in higher resolution mode than the default. Only 2 games required the expansion pack to function, Zelda Majora's Mask and Donkey Kong 64, neither of which would work without it present. Perfect Dark technically worked without the expansion pack, but some content was walled off without it, mainly the campaign. The expansion pack was available separately as well as bundled with certain games that required it for those who wanted to use one. These days, Nintendo have been known as a company with hardware gimmicks for quite a long time now, specifically when it comes to controllers. Be it the hybrid nature of the Switch, the Wii's Wiimote, or the screen controller for the Wii U, they have a long history of coming up with non-standard controllers for their consoles. Now, it could be argued that they started this trend long before the N64 was released. The Power Glove for the NES springs to mind, but it's a stretch to suggest that that was the main method of playing games on the system. The N64 controller was unique in a variety of different ways. Firstly, it features an analog stick as its primary control method, predating the PS1's DualShock controller by a year. This isn't to say that it was the absolute first controller to be released with one, because it isn't, but it was the first time it had been adopted as the default on a console. Secondly, though likely more famously, the controller was a three-pronged design, like that of a Trident with an analog stick in the middle, a D-pad on the left, and the face buttons on the right. Opinions are pretty divided on whether it's a good controller or not. Has its positive points been shaped this way? Mainly that the control scheme could be adopted to be left-handed with little effort due to how the buttons were arranged, though it usually meant that one side of the controller was awkward to use. The analog stick being in the centre and the face buttons off to one side usually meant that the D-pad, if you were right-handed, was cumbersome to use. The lack of a second stick in a 3D environment often made games clunky to control too, though this wasn't a guarantee. Mario 64 being a masterclass in 3D platforming design that revolutionised the genre. Some games managed to get around this limitation though, notably first-person shooters GoldenEye and Perfect Dark allowed two controllers to be used by one player, giving dual analog controls with one controller in each hand. It's a somewhat unwieldy solution, but creative from the developers in the face of limitations nonetheless. The back of the controller on the underside features an expansion port. It didn't natively support force feedback, and the console itself didn't have any built-in capacity to save games. Ports on the back of the controller served to remedy this. The controller pack and rumble pack added some save game support and force feedback in supporting games. Unfortunately though, only one could be used at once on a single controller, which often left games missing out on rumble or limited to an alternative save system such as passwords if the cartridge itself didn't contain a battery backup. The port could be used for a wide variety of other accessories too, though mostly with niche use, often only for a specific game such as the Japan-only biosensor used for tracking the heartbeat of the player. What's probably most well known is the add-on for Pokemon Stadium, the transfer pack. This allowed the player to connect their Gen 1 Pokemon games to the N64 and use the Pokemon contained within them, transferring them to the N64 game to battle in 3D. It could also be used to play the Game Boy games on the TV using the N64 controller. 1994 saw the initial reveal of the console. Various magazines showing off the machine itself, though nothing was mentioned of what would become of its infamous controller. Nintendo fully revealed the N64 to the public on November 24th, 1995 at the Shoshinkai trade show. The console was fully playable at the show, and hype for the impending launch was at an all-time high, with hundreds if not thousands of people eager to get their hands on the new hardware. A Christmas 1995 release window was initially planned for the N64, though this was delayed until April the following year, with Nintendo stating that the console needed more time to mature, and to give third-party developers more time to get their games ready. The April 96 launch was delayed again by a further 2 months, with the console finally debuting in Japan on June 23, 1996. Along with these delays, plans to release the console simultaneously around the world were also canned. This was down to Nintendo predicting that they wouldn't be able to manufacture enough units to meet the demands of a worldwide launch, a far cry from the Wii's launch a decade later. Japan saw its entire stock of 300,000 units sold within the first day of release, with a further 200,000 more sold over the next few days. The chaos Nintendo caused with the release of their previous system, the SNES, was thankfully avoided by using far more stalls to get consoles into the hands of the public, thus enabling a smooth launch of the console. A 3-month release delay in the US saw many consoles hitting the grey market, importers selling the system at a huge markup of over $700, over 3 times the retail price of $200. It was initially planned to launch at $250, however due to PlayStation and Saturn both being available and selling for $200 at the time, Nintendo decided to reduce the price in order to be more competitive with Sega and Sony's offerings. Nintendo continued their trend of having tiny game lineups at launch. In Japan, 3 games were available: Pilotwings 64, a board game whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce, and Super Mario 64. The US launch was even smaller still, with just Mario and Pilotwings available, due to several titles including Wave Race 64 and Turok being delayed. It might seem that a console launching with only 2 or 3 games might hinder its release, but it didn't, largely because Super Mario 64 is the best 3D platform ever made, at least at the time anyway. It's debatable whether or not it still holds that title, but a compelling case can be made for it today. The games industry had struggled somewhat with the transition to 3D, taming cameras and designing fluid controls that took into account a whole new axis of movement, often brought down otherwise great games. Mario 64 somehow managed to design fluid and dynamic controls with a camera that, while not perfect, tends to behave itself more often than not, and still holds up pretty well today. Europe had to wait until March the following year to get their hands on the console. The limited number of games available in other territories was expanded on a little, with 6 making it to market on day 1. Mario 64 and Pilot Wings remained, and were joined by the delayed Turok and Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, as well as sports games like FIFA 64. Wave Race 64, however, was nowhere to be seen. That aside, it was a good lineup of games available in Europe that covered several different genres, meaning there was nearly something for everyone at launch. Nintendo's previous attempt at a disc-based add-on for one of their consoles hadn't gone so well, with it effectively turning into the competition that was currently dominating everything. During the early days of the N64's development, when storage options were being considered, a disk drive was floated around as an option. But upon realising that this would negatively impact the price of the console, pushing it out of the $200 window that they were aiming for, the decision to stick with cartridges was made, with the idea being to add disk functionality later. The 64DD was developed with a proprietary floppy disk over the CD format due to the read-write nature of the medium, as well as functions such as a real-time clock. This would allow backing up of data, theoretically enabling more options when it came to the type of software that could be run on the system. Announced at the same event as the N64 itself, with a physical reveal at the same event a year later, the 64DD was initially planned to be released at some point during 1997. This vague deadline was missed though, by quite a margin, missing its projected launch window by 2 years, finally hitting store shelves in December of 1999 in Japan. During this period, no North American or European release date was ever mentioned, and unsurprisingly, it remained a Japanese exclusive. While over 60 games were announced for the 64DD, a mere 10 games were released during its short lifespan, the add-on being discontinued less than 2 years after it launched. Many of the games announced got moved over to Nintendo's next generation console, the GameCube, converted to regular N64 games, or just outright cancelled. Of the 10 released titles, an F-Zero X expansion was probably the most notable release, offering up 12 new tracks, a vehicle creator, and a full course creator. A substantial update to a game that already had plenty of content, proving that the concept could have worked. I'll be keeping an eye out for a 64DD for that alone. SimCity 64 and Doshin the Giant also got 64DD releases, the latter of which was even released with updated graphics on the GameCube a few years later. An online subscription service called RANNet was also available for the 64DD. It allows users to browse the internet and share custom artwork. No online play was ever brought to the system, though it was reportedly in the works by several third-party developers. A downloadable NES emulator and games were even planned at one point, with the emulator itself reportedly being complete, but cancelled before it saw the light of day. Overall, the 64DD was a failure. Critically, it performed reasonably, with reviews praising its simplicity and online functionality, but finding it limited. Perhaps had the system gotten the proposed online play, it may have been more successful, or maybe the $90 asking price was just too much at the time for what was on offer. Either way, it was discontinued in 2001, less than 2 years after it launched. It's unknown exactly how many units were sold, but at the point of closure of RANNet, around 15,000 accounts were remained active, meaning at the very least, Nintendo managed to sell that many units. The N64 was a bit of an odd duck. It started the generation strongly, launching with Super Mario 64 and selling out its opening weekend in Japan. It was off to a great start. However, the losses of third-party developers such as Squaresoft and Capcom, due in part to the use of cartridges in what had become a world dominated by CD-based media, was undoubtedly a major blow for the platform. A very strong list of first-party games throughout the generation, Zelda Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie, and Mario Kart 64, etc., are all lauded and routinely feature in best game ever lists. The 64DD failed and didn't see the light of day outside of Japan, making it 2 generations in a row that Nintendo failed to capitalise on the emerging trend of CDs as a medium. Critics generally praised the platform, the graphics typically getting good reviews, with Time magazine even awarding it Machine of the Year in 1996. It wasn't especially successful commercially outside of its initial launch window, comfortably being outsold by the PlayStation, and even Sega's flailing Saturn in Japan. A low number of games being released in general, but specifically a low number of RPG titles in Japan, was cited as the reason for this by then CEO Hiroshi Yamauchi. Across its 6-year lifespan, it sold a little over 32 million units, significantly less than the SNES before it, nearly half as many as the NES before that, a downward sales trend of hardware that Nintendo was unable to shake for another decade. Still, even with all this being said, the N64 is one of the most beloved consoles in Nintendo's history, even if it is retroactively. Original N64 hardware has started to get pretty expensive as of late, games even more so. They're not particularly difficult to get a hold of though, so if you're wanting to experience it as intended, then it is available. For most though, Nintendo Switch Online is likely going to be the easiest and cheapest legal way of experiencing N64 games now. The selection available isn't huge at the moment, but it's ever growing and it's an easy and convenient method of getting to some of the best games ever made. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving it a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Did you own an N64? If so, what was your favourite game for it? Do you have fond memories of nights filled with GoldenEye multiplayer, or trying to get every star in Super Mario 64? Let me know down in the comments.